I think most of us would agree that the first idea I played was just more swinging than the second one. Today, we're going to look at some things we could do in the practice room that can help us dial up that swing quotient in our playing. What's up, everyone? Thanks for joining me today as always. Today, we're looking at 3 things that we can do to make ourselves hopefully a more swinging improviser. Now, there are not just 3 things that contribute to our swing feel. There are many things, but these are the 3 things that I really try to target when I'm feeling like my own playing is maybe a little off the rails in that way, or definitely when I'm listening to a student, for example, and they need to develop their swing. These are some of the things I look for. Now, we're going to be working from a perspective that assumes that we sort of know what swing eighth notes are. We're not going to talk about that. That's incredibly important. That has to come through listening, as we'll talk about a little later in the lesson. But we're not necessarily going to talk about swung eighth notes. We're going to talk about all the other stuff that we need to worry about. So, point number 1 to make yourself as swinging as possible is refining your sound. Now, all of us have to work on this regardless of instrument, but because I'm a trombone player, a brass player, and maybe some of you viewing this are maybe not brass players, I'm actually going to kick point 1 to the end of this lesson. Even though I think it's incredibly important, we're actually going to talk about it at the end, so maybe those of you who are not brass players can check out points 2 and 3 first, and then maybe, you duck out why I talk about how we develop sound on this instrument. So we're actually going to jump to point number 2. So our second element on our swing checklist is whether we are selecting rhythms that lend themselves to swing. Now, lots of rhythms can swing, downbeats can swing, offbeats can swing, but I would argue if we rely too much on too many downbeats in a row, it's probably going to make our ideas feel a little bit stiff. Now, there's nothing wrong with that idea. It's a nice melody. But if we add just a few anticipations, a few offbeats in there, it's suddenly going to swing much easier. Not that we might not be able to make that first one swing. We might be able to. But if swing is not your forte, if you add just a few anticipations, it's going to click almost immediately for you. If we look at that idea I just played, the first way I played it, I started on a downbeat, on the downbeat of 1, and I have lots of downbeat-oriented ideas. I land on every single downbeat. When I shifted it, and the key element, I think, is actually starting on the offbeat. The rest of the stuff could actually stay relatively similar, and if we look at the 2 ideas next to each other, we can see I still landed on the downbeat of 2, still started sort of the second half of the phrase on the downbeat of 3, but it's that anticipation at the beginning of the bar, starting a phrase on an offbeat, is what really makes it swinging. So whenever you have an idea, if it feels like it's maybe not quite there, think about, can I start it on the offbeat as a pickup note, in this case on the end of 4, or maybe start it on the offbeat on the end of 1, depending on what's going on. You can see the way I finish this phrase off, I change the second half of it to starting on the end of 1 for sort of a little round off to the phrase. So the second half of this phrase brings up the second thing we can worry about when we're thinking about what rhythms we are selecting. And that is making sure that we end phrases, rather than sort of leaving them hanging, that we end them with some sort of punctuation. I would argue to really find swing, you want to find do dot at the end of your phrases. In our example ideas, we've got 2 do dots. They're in the middle chunk, do dot, and then probably the most punctuated one, do dot at the end. Those have kind of levels of accent, which we'll talk about in a second, that really provides the propulsion in this line towards the latter half of the phrase. The question is, how do we take this concept into the practice room? There's a couple exercises that we can do. Most of these are very foundational. The first one, we might just select any rhythm that we think is a good little rhythmic unit. It could be a measure, could be 2 measures, and we are going to move that through the chord changes of a tune, probably just all in the roots. So I'm going to play this idea, 1, 2, 3. That's and 2, and 4, and. So I'm just going to take a B flat blues, and I'm going to play that on the root of all of the chords. It's going to be very straight up, nothing flashy. It's all about finding those rhythms, being really in the pocket. I'm going to finesse it just a little bit when I get to the end of the form, just to kind of round out at a nice ending. But that is going to be the rhythm that I'm going to use just on roots. Once that's feeling solid and you've maybe worked that through a handful of different rhythmic units, little chunks of rhythm, You want to move that through the blues in maybe some more melodic ways, harmonic ways, possibly thinking about all minor pentatonic, maybe all the chord tones, anything like that. Just hear what that would sound like. I'm going to take, again, a rhythmic unit, move it through the blues using only minor pentatonic. It's actually going to help me build some nice little chunks of minor pentatonic vocabulary that feel like they have a lot of sort of rhythmic continuity and sort of rhythmic integrity that they swing through the entire form. Simple, clear uses of swinging rhythms is really where we want to be to work on this stuff. So try this. You can use it on any concept. You can use it something simple like the minor pentatonic. You can go all the way to really advance on a more complicated tune. But this is foundational practice, and if you're feeling like swing is maybe a challenge for you, this will really help get you there to build your rhythmic vocabulary. All right, on to point number 3, and then we'll circle back for sound at the end. So point number 3, I already alluded to, we're thinking about levels of accent. What notes are important? What notes are less important? To break this down, let's look at the last 4 bars of the tune Tenor Madness. So we're going to zoom in on the first 2 bars of that phrase to really identify where some of this stuff happens. Now, in reality, you need to learn this through listening. We can analyze it, and that can give you a good framework to really get detailed about what's going on, but you have to learn this through listening. There is no other way to really get this in a real sense. If you want to learn to speak this language, you need to listen to native speakers, just like you would any other language, to catch the nuance, the inflection, the pacing, all that sort of stuff. We can talk about the rules, but if you do not get serious about listening, there's almost no point in even trying. So take that for what you will. It's an incredibly important step. And really all the stuff we talk about here is really just to support that step. So getting into Tenor Madness here, what we want to think about when we're looking for these important notes, there's a couple of components that we could worry about. It might sometimes be the top note of an 8th note line. It might be a certain little melodic passage where we maybe have important voice leading notes. That's what's happening on this one. It might have to do with rhythm, like we mentioned, do dots at the end of the phrase. That dot is going to be important, or maybe an anticipation at the beginning of the phrase. So if we look at Tenor Madness here, I've labeled all the important notes in red. And as I mentioned, it has to do with the voice leading. This melody works off of going from a C to a B natural to a B flat to an A. That's kind of like what drives this little chunk of the melody forward. And so we want to hear those notes. That's really the melody. Dot. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And dot, dot, dot. That's where it's at. Everything else is a little bit less important, so they need to get a little more emphasis. Now, you can see I did label that C before the B natural in blue. To me, that gets just a little more emphasis, but not as much as the red ones. There are levels here, and that's what's important to kind of connect with. If I had to be hard-pressed, I'd say because that's an offbeat that starts an 8th note line. But again, if you listen to Sonny Rollins, that's how he plays it. Now, what about the unimportant notes in this line? So basically everything else is a little less important, but then there's one note that is the least important from an articulation and emphasis standpoint, and that is the bottom note, the C natural. That note is going to be pretty ghosted. And getting these ghosted notes to work right is a key element, especially when you're playing bebop, to making swing happen. So here it is the bottom of the line, and then we jump right back up. So that is why it's going to get ghosted. You know, I still played it. You could still hear the pitch and the tone. If we were going at full tempo, it might be a little bit less. To me, when I think about a ghosted note, it's all about feeling rhythm, but not really hearing tone. So I might hear a little bit of articulation, but I'm probably not going to feel the full tone of that note. All right, circling all the way back to number 1, that is sound. So if you're a brass player, this could be important to you. If you're not, it's probably going to be a little less important to you, but developing sound on whatever instrument you play is critical. If your sound is not compelling, I can't necessarily say good. There's a lot of sounds that could be good, especially when we're talking about, as an improviser, as a jazz musician, but you have to think your sound is compelling. J.J. Johnson, Carl Fontana, they played with wildly different sounds in many cases, but they are both important sounds to understand because they compelled listeners to want to listen to them. And so that's really what we want to be connecting with, is building a compelling sound that we hear in our head. Whether that's good is a question for another day. For me, there are two elements that we want to worry about when we're thinking about how sound and swing interact. The first is just developing our sound like we would playing any type of music. For us as brass players, that largely means doing long tones. So for me, my sort of go-to long tone exercise is maybe a little variation on the classic Remington long tones, where we're going first, second, first, third, first, fourth, all that sort of good stuff. I like to do it slightly faster and with all glisses between the notes. I always start by going out and then I'll sort of turn the corner, start in 6, work my way back in. I'm really listening for evenness, especially over all of those glisses. It's a great way to monitor your sound. So your air, we're really thinking about flow here. You know, I'm almost not even concerned whether my sound is good. I bet when I listen back to this, I'm going to be like, oh man, my sound could be improved, because that's how I feel when I edit every single video. But what we want to think about is my air flowing? And especially as I move my slide, does the air flow through that slide movement? Or is it kind of flowing through the long note, dips down on the slide movement, and then comes back up on the next long note? That's what many trombone players do, so we get this unevenness. I strive for a really even sound across the entire horn. Not that I always achieve that, but that's what I'm working for. So that way, when I want to think about any of these articulation details of an accent here, a ghost note here, I'm starting from a place of evenness. To me, that is the key. The other way that I like to concern myself with sound when it connects to swing is how articulation comes into play. The way the tongue and the air need to work together is at the root of many of the problems and solutions to problems for us as brass players. And so really getting them to be coordinated and work together is what I'm concerned about. So I'll take a simple 5-note scale, B flat C, D, E flat F, just going up relatively slow. I like to play it first, all as slurred as possible, so as little tongue as I can. Second, I might move to playing it with a tenuto style, so long notes, so I still really emphasize flow, but a little bit more articulation at the beginning of the note. And then finally, I'll play them as shorter notes, maybe like housetop accents, dots, that sort of thing, to see if I can really get that more assertive articulation to work with the airflow. Now, no promises that that was absolutely pristine. All these concepts, in all honesty, are things that I find to be very difficult. I've mentioned many times on this channel, I am by no means a virtuoso on this instrument. I find the trombone to be pretty difficult. It's in some ways the hardest part about being a musician for me. So I am constantly trying to refine this element of my playing, but in all honesty, I'm just not very natural at this instrument. So it's kind of a constant struggle, but I always keep these things very much at the forefront of my mind, because when I do get them dialed in and they are working, I feel like my playing just blossoms, and especially the swing and feel component, man, they feel better when all these foundations are really, really working. So make sure to invest time here, even though it's boring and it can be kind of a drag to practice, especially if the trombone feels like it doesn't always behave for you. It really pays big dividends in your playing. Cool. Move some of these things into the practice room. These are all foundational exercises. Take some of them, add them to a warm-up, add them to some of the ways that you get started on a tune. Make sure you don't neglect listening. It is absolutely the key. None of this stuff matters if you do not do a lot of listening and really listen with rhythm and how the feel affects the ideas at the forefront of your mind. It just doesn't matter if you don't do that stuff. So make sure you don't neglect that stuff. That's really where it's at. Other than that, we'll see you in the woodshed.